I started these lectures, I thought about how Iranians today identify their country in various ways, but in particular with a long heritage of kingship, a great and justified pride in literature, particularly in poetry, and a strong identification with Shiite Islam, although a contested identification because many Iranians who left Iran after the Islamic Revolution have developed somewhat ambivalent attitudes towards Shiism, in my experience among them in the United States. Nevertheless, there seems to be no question but that Shiism is a distinctive facet of of Iranian culture and identity for the last several centuries. Now, when did that start? The work that I did for my doctoral thesis, going back to the 1960s, dealt with the city of Nishapur, primarily in the 11th and 12th centuries. I had a couple of thousand names of individuals who were prominent in Islamic circles at that time. And with the rarest exception, they were all Sunnis. And indeed, it was very hard to find any concrete evidence in the sources I was using, which were Sunni sources, for a substantial Shiite presence in Nishapur. So I came to think of Iran in the early centuries of Islam as being primarily represented by Sunni Muslims who had their own internal divisions. And I've talked in these lectures about how I see that sort of civilian religious elite appearing and gaining dominance within Iran over the course of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, with sort of a culmination in the 11th century, and then a distinct tapering off in the 12th before the Mongols arrive early in the 13th. So that's a timeline. Now, when I read about Shiism or talk to people about Shiism in Iran, I've discovered there is a dramatic difference in the timeline that people express in talking about the subject. At one extreme, you have people who sense that Shiism almost arose to fit an Iranian mentality, and that in some sort of paradoxical sense, Iranians were Shiite even before Ali, because it fits into a sort of gestalt they have conceived of going back into Zoroastrian times, and that therefore there shouldn't be any real query about Shiism in Iran. It's always been part of the Iranian soul and mentality. At the other extreme, you have people who, basing themselves on specific textual sources, who say that Shiism was adopted by a charismatic ruler at the beginning of the 1500s, and that his insistence that people be Shiite led to punishing drives in certain cities to force people to profess the Shiite faith and to abjure previous attachments to Sunnism. That is portrayed as being a forced conversion of Iran to Shiism. There are other scholars who have seen Shiism as a gradually rising phenomenon that can go back to several centuries before 1500, and that the publicized forced conversions, so-called, of the early 1500s are not typical, but they are things that are specific to certain situations in certain cities. It would be nice to have data that would actually tell us something about all of this. But even determining what data you would use is a difficult question. I have explored bits and pieces of data. For example, in 395, just near the year 1000, a judge from Nishapur, a chief judge, found himself in Baghdad, and he was called in by the caliph. And the caliph said, my ancestor, Harun al-Rashid, is buried in Tus, which is all sort of within your jurisdiction as the chief qadi of northeastern Iran. And I have heard reports that his tomb in Tus has become dilapidated. And I want you to go back home and, as a pious but also dutiful officer of a Sunni regime, I want you to see to the restoration of the tomb. And the response of the Qadi was basically that there's a whole gang of Shiites who hang out around the tomb of Ali Reza, which is next to the tomb of Harun al-Rashid. And it would not be worth the fight it would take to intervene in that community, restore the tomb of Harun al-Rashid. And therefore, I won't do it. That is an indication that you did have a strong group of Shiite zealots or passionate Shiites by the year 1000. And in certain parts of Iran, particularly in the mountains of the northern part of Iran and in certain groups elsewhere, we have evidence of a strong Shiite sentiment, particularly with the Ismaili Shiites who become very important in Isfahan and places in the mountains. So we have spotty information about concentrations of Shiite passion in a number of places in Iran, going back to before the year 1000 or back to the 10th and 11th centuries. But how do you read that? Do you say that this is 1% of the Sunni, 1% of the Muslim population, or 5%, or 20%? Is it on the way to becoming a Shiite land? Or is it, in fact, a Sunni land that simply has certain areas that are susceptible to an appeal made by Shiite imams? The general approach of Western scholars earlier in the 20th century was to argue that because after 945, a group of people from the northern mountains of Iran, led by a family known as the Bulliets, became dominant in the caliphate. They took over in Baghdad and had their courts in Shiraz and Isfahan and Ray and other places in the western Iran, that because they were Shiites, therefore Iran became Shiite at that time. And then it became Sunni after that. This is the theory of the Sunni revival. I think that nowadays, while there's no question that there are very concrete and important expressions of Sunni Islam after the Bulliet period, I think there's more of a question of to what degree did the Bulliets actually foster a general movement toward Shiism during the 10th century when they were most important. We certainly get reports of permitting Shia commemorations of the martyrdom of Imam Hossein appearing at that time. We have many reports about communal conflicts in Baghdad between Shiites and Sunnis. But this is really focused on the culture of the court and on what is reported of certain key cities. We still don't know what to think about the countryside. And the countryside, I think, is important. There is always this question in periods of religious change. And here, I must say that I think that you can think about the rise of Shiism in Iran in a way as a conversion phenomenon. That is to say, not a conversion phenomenon where people are shifting from Christianity to Islam or Judaism to Zoroastrian or something like that, but in the other sense of conversion that people trace back to the writings of William James, where you're talking about people changing their identity of the religion without actually changing to a different religion, but simply finding a new mode of expression that is appealing within their faith. And James was talking about conversion phenomena among American Protestants who would go to camp meetings, get the faith and take Jesus into their hearts and become changed people. So was there something like that where people who were Sunni became Shiite for some reason? Again, data for anything other than a few big cities is vanishingly scarce. But we do know certain things. And one of them is that in the 11th century, and not very much before, so far as I can tell from what I've read, you get a very strong interest in making pilgrimages, not simply to Mecca, even though the pilgrimage to Mecca does undergo a remarkable increase in importance in the 13th century after the destruction of the Caliphate of Baghdad by the Mongols, but local pilgrimages where people would have a mazar, a place of pious visit, that they would make a ziyarat, that they would visit for the purpose of making a vow, curing an illness, solving an infertility problem, any number of reasons. We have evidence of shrines, or even simply more ordinary graves of people who become thought of as vehicles of blessing, who can answer your prayer, istajaba da'wah, where you are seeking a response to a dua, to a prayer. Lists of places where you can make pilgrimage begin to appear in different areas, or among travel writers who also become important in the 11th century. Often when they say, I went to such and such place, they will list who are the important people buried there. Visitation to graves becomes a visible phenomenon in the 11th and 12th centuries. But it may always have been there. I suspect it was. And that this is something that goes back to local expressions of faith that are pre-Islamic in some cases. I know of one place that reveres the footprint of Ali, eponymous, a progenitor of the Shiites, although that footprint very possibly was before that the footprint of Buddha, or, finding the original lineage of a shrine can take you from one religion to another. Who are the people whose graves are visited? That might give some sense of where the weight of Muslim sensibility lies. Going back to Nishapur, the city that I studied so much and have devoted so much time to, there is one text that lists places to visit for blessing, to tombs to visit in Nishapur. And we actually have 4 different lists of the names of people who were known for their scholarship or piety or eminence as Muslims who might be visited. The earliest list, these are not dated lists. I infer the dates for other reasons. The earliest list maybe contains about 50 people, many of them very famous, eminent individuals in the history of Sunni Islam, with the exception of one descendant of the Prophet, or one eminent early associate of descendants of the Prophet. There are no obvious Shiites on the list, nor does the list tell you where the graves are located. It says, for blessing, you should go to the graves of these people, and then lists names. What that tells me is that they didn't need to tell you how to find the graves, because you simply go to Nishapur, you say, where do I find the grave of so-and-so? And then you go and you pray there. In other words, the city at the time that list was compiled appears to be robust. The next list, well, let's say a later list, the chronology of the list is a little obscure. The later list is smaller in the number of people visited, and it tells you how to find the graves, orienting you towards certain buildings or remains of buildings. And it includes the grave of Farid ad-Din Attar, the famous Sufi poet, who is universally taken to have been killed at the time of the Mongol conquest of Nishapur. So what I divine from the directions given how to find the graves is that Nishapur was now in ruins, and that there wasn't anyone local whom you could ask. You couldn't go and say, where would I find the grave of so-and-so? Because there was no one to talk to, or the people who remained had no recollection where the important people of yesteryear had been buried. Now, what's interesting about this later list then, this, say, post-Mongol list, is that it's the first half of the list is primarily of major Shiite figures, or major within that regional formulation. Toward the end of the list, you find some names back that would have appeared on the first list, but very few of them. And it's evident that the pilgrims who came to Nishapur for pious reasons, because obviously they're not coming on business, they're not coming to study all the things they might have done in the 10th or 11th centuries, because now the city is in ruins. So these are people who are coming specifically to perform devotions at the burial sites or shrines devoted to certain people, particularly to people eminent in the Shiite world. The shrines that survive, going back to that era, even though the architecture of the current shrine may have been added to and changed substantially later, but the shrines that survive are not simply of eminent Shiites. They are also of eminent Sufis, so that Abu Abdullah al-Ansari in Herat would be one, Sheikh of Jam and Torbat Jam be another. The visitation to the shrines, pilgrimage sites of members of the family of Ali and of Shiites specifically, and of Sufis, seem to be a part of a sort of localized pattern of religious expression, rather different from the sort of universalizing pattern that I've talked about earlier when I talked about the collection of hadith, where people would go from northeast Iran to Yemen or to Damascus to find lore about Islam. Now people were traveling more locally, not so much to find lore as to find religious experience. So I think there's a kind of growth of charisma, in a sense, or of openness to charisma. Long ago, when I studied conversion to Islam, I paid attention to the names that people gave their children. And one striking phenomenon was that if you take a cluster of the names Muhammad, Ahmed, Ali, Al-Hassan, and Al-Hussein as a group, names that come basically from the immediate family of the Prophet Muhammad. If you take that as a group, there are very few people at the beginning of evidence dealing with names in Nishapur or elsewhere in Iran. The other two cities I studied being Isfahan and Gorgan. Those names are not common early on. They rise in importance, and other groups of names decline. Let's say in the earliest period, the types of names that you would find most commonly would be names that relate to Arab tribes, names many of which would have been used before Islam in that particular tribe, not with no particular Muslim overtone to the name. Or you would find names that were biblical, Quranic, names that could easily be names with double meaning, so that a person who had been a Christian might choose the name Yusuf because Christian Arabs would take Yusuf as a Christian name, but Muslims would take it as a Muslim name. So Arab tribal names and sort of double meaning Quranic and biblical names, those are the names that you find earliest on. They decline, the Arab names quite rapidly, the biblical names more gradually, and in their place, these five names grow very, very strongly until about the middle of the 9th century or so. Then they begin to diminish, but not diminishing because people are no longer interested in religious naming. They're diversifying religious naming. So it's in the sort of late 9th century that people begin to explore a large variety of names beginning with Abd, Abdullah, Abdul Rahman, etc. And I can see, in a sense, that in some cases, it's fairly easy to see why you got more variety. I know of one important family in Nishapur who, at a certain point, they had 5 sons, all of them named Muhammad. And so distinguishing them, people wanted more variety. Among those people who appear to, by my analysis, to be entering Islam, to be converting to Islam, after the middle of the 9th century. Those who are converting in the 900s, for example. Those people are different in respect to adopting the 5 key Muslim names: Muhammad, Ahmed, Ali, Hassan, Hossein, almost 100%. They're up over 80% to around 90% of these late converts are choosing names that are within the family of the Prophet. Does that mean anything? I presume it means a very forceful expression of a newly adopted Muslim identity, but the Muslim identity is becoming much more associated with names that include major Shiite names, Ali, Hassan, and Hossein, than it was before. I came to the conclusion from these hints here and there, and from studies that I did indicating an exodus from Iran of many people belonging to the learned civilian elite in the Iranian diaspora. I came to think that it may be that at the lower levels of the economic strata of Iran in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, that Shiism might have become more and more common, or alternatively, that Shiism and Sufism together might have become more and more common, and that the overall society was dominated by traditional Sunni scholars of law and Quranic recitation and things of that sort. If you took away the upper crust, if they fled, if they looked for opportunities elsewhere, as the conditions in the country deteriorated, and they would be selectively able to flee in a way that people who were not literate in Arabic, were not sophisticated, could not necessarily find jobs if they left. If you took away that class of people, what was left? Is it possible that the common people of Iran by the 12th, 13th century were already oriented toward a kind of Sufi, Shiite, Alid focus of what Islam meant to them, and that this was something that had come into being over the previous 200 or 300 years, but hadn't been visible because so much attention and fame had attached to the Sunni civilian elite. I think of somewhat comparable situations in history. One that comes to mind is the Russian Revolution. I was reading recently a memoir of an English electrical engineer, as we now call him, who worked in the Soviet Union from basically the beginning, 1918 or so, down to 1933. And one thing he remarks again and again is that the old intelligentsia no longer exists. And when you read about white Russian emigres who go to other countries and flee the Russian Revolution, it is clear that educated people who could leave because they had either the means or the education and the skills and languages other than Russian, those constituted a stratum of very important for 19th century and early 20th century Russian history. And that stratum is stripped off. So what do you get after that? Well, there's a very insightful book by Sheila Fitzpatrick on the first generation of university students after the Bolshevik takeover of the country and the establishment of the USSR. And she talks about how admission to the universities was shifted from the offspring of the old intelligentsia, who are not permitted to go to the university. And now it is only the workers and peasants, sons and daughters, who go into the university. That the quality of their training changes, obviously, because they have a different social stratum. Both they aren't equipped to study as they had before, but they also are the people who will now form the core population that builds the Soviet Union and contributes leadership to the remarkable accomplishments in terms of industrialization and so forth, but also to the oppressive side of Soviet rule in the Stalinist era. So we do have comparisons And you like throw in the movement of the Huguenots from France, of the Muslims and Jews who were expelled from Spain, or even the Tory royalists who left the United States for Britain or Canada at the time of the American Revolution. In other words, this phenomenon of stripping off the elite, the most educated, the most prosperous, has occurred again and again. And the histories usually sort of marginalize these people who flee and talk about who is left. But the people who flee leave a certain vacuum. And who is there to fill that vacuum? They're people of a different stratum of society. So if it were something like the Soviet case, you would say, well, the madrasas, the higher learning centers in Nishapur that made the famous, contributed so much to the fame of the city, that their population would have shifted from being the sons of Sunni scholars to the sons of, say, the equivalent of workers and peasants in that era. But those madrasas have been destroyed. It wasn't simply that the civilian religious elite leaves Iran, but the institutions that they inhabited largely declined. So you don't have a continuation of the colleges. You do, however, have a continuation and a dramatic growth of institutions that cater specifically to Sufis. And you have a growing number of people who identify with Sufism. Were the common people of Iran already Shiite by, say, the time of the Mongol invasion in the early 13th century? I think many were, but I think that it is more important to think, to conceive of the common people of Iran as being experiencing religion in a different way. Less importance put on the hadith of the Prophet, on the details of Islamic law, on those things that were being transmitted within the milieu of the Sunni elite in their madrasas and study centers. And that the common people of Iran, I think, had a greater openness to emotional expression and to recognizing charisma in leaders, and to seeking, in particular, to seeking blessings from the places that they associated with these charismatic individuals, whether they were members of the family of Ali, whether they were explicitly Shiite, or whether they were Sufis. Now, let's jump ahead to the century before 1500, because that's the turning point. There's a lot to look at in that century. But one thing I think that upon which scholarship seems to converge is the idea that in the post-Mongol period, the Mongol rulers of Iran, Abu Sa'id, the last of the Ilkhans, dies in 1335. And in the post-Mongol period, there is a great deal of religious ferment focused on the new areas of Islamization in Anatolia, and to some degree elsewhere, but primarily in Anatolia. And this took the form of political power moving to tribes. We know the names of the tribes. The names of the tribes include often the places where the tribes were most active, particularly northern Syria and eastern Anatolia. Say the Rum Lu would be central Anatolia, the people from Rum. The Dhul Qadr Lu would be people from northern Syria. There are others. These are so-called Qizilbash tribes. Qizilbash, the red head, referring to head structure, a kind of turban or hat that had folds in it and was red. And they're thought of as being not highly educated so much as responsive to the appeals of specific Sufi tribal, two Sufi leaders with a tribal clientele. And so you have important people who rise like Haji Bektash, who will have a Bektashi following, and they're considered a Sufi brotherhood. Then you have the followers of the saintly Safiyuddin Safavi, and these are the Safavids. The Bektashis and the Safavids this is the range from Safavids in northwestern Iran, with the great shrine of their earliest saints being in Erdebil, and the Bektashis on the Anatolian side. There seems to be a strong correlation between a tribal structure and tribal sets of allegiance and involvement in movements like the Safaviya or the Bektashiya. And there are others, more short-term, have a less enduring impact, but it's a period of great ferment in that particular area. Everyone's agreed that the Safavi movement that takes over in Iran right after 1500 comes from this Sufi background with a strong tribal following among the so-called Qizilbash tribes. They're the people identified as bringing Shiism to Iran. Now, this was supposedly a decision made by Shah Ismail, their sort of charismatic founder, that they would identify themselves as Shiite. And there's always been a question of how this came about, because Ismail was extremely young at the time, supposedly, when this determination was made. He had advisors from these major tribes. The fact that you had forced conversions or forced vocalizations of loyalty to Ali and his family are reported in the chronicles of the early Safavid period. But it seems to me highly implausible that the Safavids were trying to turn a Sunni country into a Shiite country. It seems more likely to me that they were discovering that there wasn't enough power within the sort of Sufi tribal confederation that they were leading to become dominant throughout the country, unless they could find some means of identifying with the everyday population of Iran. And to some degree, their parallels in Anatolia thought the same thing, because the Bektashis, they're at least semi-Shiite, they are Sufi, but they merge with the rising Ottoman state, which is clearly a Sunni state, and their peculiarities are accepted within the Ottoman state, and they become key to the military power by providing the religious guidance for the Janissary Corps, which is the famous center of the Ottoman armies. So the Bektashis lean toward alliance with a Sunni state. The Safavids create a Shiite state, and then the Sunni and the Shiite states are at loggerheads for the next several centuries, and that's the very famous confrontation between Sunni and Shiite Islam that still resonates in today's Muslim world. I would suggest that the people of Iran were more open to Shiism than they were to having basically Turkic-speaking tribesmen running the entire country everywhere, and that the allegiance of the Safavid elite for Shiism is a way of merging with an Iranian population that has already become, for the most part, if not Shiite, at least sympathetic to Shiism, more sympathetic to Shiism than to a kind of heterodox militant Sufism. One of the interesting corollaries of this is that if the Safavid realm adopted Shiism, who were the people who were in a position to lead the country religiously? There were no madrasas left. You did not have, so far as I've been able to perceive, you didn't have a large block of religious teachers embedded in a structured institutional framework capable of producing Shiite prayer leaders and so forth for the entire country. So the Safavids very consciously imported learned Shiite scholars from Lebanon and from Northeast Arabia, Bahrain, and set them up in new madrasas, which worked very well. That is to say, they were able to create almost from scratch a generation of Shiite scholars, the like of which had not been known previously in Iran. And that, to me, it's a little bit like what happens with Moscow University after the Bolshevik Revolution, that if you have a Shiite land, but you don't have a tradition of Shiite scholarship and religious leadership at the highest level. Where do ambitious and financially capable young Iranians, where do they learn how to be part of that Shiite religion that they now openly espouse? Well, the Safavids figured this out and made it work. But the residue is this idea that somehow Iran was forced to convert to Shiism by militant Shiites in the Safavid empire. So when it comes to the overall question I started with, when did Iran become Shiite? I try to be sympathetic to people on both extremes and recognize that I don't know a whole lot that would prove my position vis-a-vis theirs. Nevertheless, I think that the tidbits of plausible data that I've accumulated over a period of years points to the idea that you had the Sunni elite is moving in directions that later are culminate outside of Iran, in India and Syria and Turkey and so on. And that Sunni elite includes a strong orientation for some people toward Shiism, toward Sufism, but not of the most ecstatic sort of Sufism. There are exceptions like Abu Sa'id ibn Abu Khair. So these tidbits suggest that you had this establishment strongly institutionalized. The decline of the country, for reasons I've talked about before, leads to a diaspora that strips off this elite population, educated elite. And what is lying underneath is a layer of popular sentiment that is drawn toward charisma, toward the search for baraka, for blessing, and toward localization of charisma, as opposed to going far abroad to seek lore of the Prophet or to make a pilgrimage all the way to Mecca. This population, I think, was not intrinsically Shiite, but it was very open to the Shiite passions that show up in the commemoration of the martyrdom of Hossein and the whole reverence for the lives of the sainted imams of the early Islamic period. When the Safavids came along several centuries later and were looking for a way to rule Iran that did not depend upon the Iranians all accepting the total dominance of Turkic tribesmen from the far northwest, but also making Iran making their regime a distinctive regime. I think that they gravitated toward Shiism because it was in tune with very, very common sentiments and feelings within the Iranian population of everyday people. And then on top of that, using foreign talent, sort of bringing the diaspora home. We exported Sufi scholars, we imported Shiite scholars. They recreated an institutional and educational structure of the sort that the Sunnis had 5 centuries earlier, and now Iran was going to have it again, and it would become part of an Iranian identity that survived to the present day. Thank you very much.